So I remember the first creative protest that made an impact on me. I was at college in Central Ohio. It was in the mid-1980s and apartheid was a big topic. Each day on the way to classes, I walked through this large grassy common area. But one morning, the whole common area was covered in cardboard tent-like structures. People were sleeping in them. Some of them were really elaborate with like multiple rooms, and many of them had writings or drawings on the side that said things like, "Divest from South Africa, end apartheid, we demand accountability." I was really floored by it. These were some of my fellow students. Did they really think that they were going to get something to happen by sleeping in cardboard boxes? It turns out, yes. Yes, they did. They were a part of a movement to create shanty towns replicating the poor settlements of Black South Africans living under apartheid. And my fellow students lived in them until the college divested from all of their investments in South Africa. And the college did. And this collective divestiture was one of the many contributing factors to ending centuries of racial separation in South Africa. If they had stood on the corner with signs, I may have written them off. If they had petitions, I may have signed it, but I wouldn't have learned anything from it. But because they set up cardboard shanty towns in the common area for weeks on end, and I walked through them every day, and because the people in them seemed to be having a really good time with music and dancing and writing the messages and drawing, I took notice, and I've remembered it ever since. This is Martin Luther King Jr. weekend. It is traditional here at UUCP that we do a service on racial justice or equity or one of the many topics that Dr. King spoke about or that are alive and real in our time. And this year is a little different because we are talking about white supremacy culture each month and how we live into our 8th principle, asking us to dismantle the structures of racism and oppression. But also it is different because the family of Dr. King this year has asked folks not to just celebrate this year, but to demand that voting reforms are passed, something that our own Arizona senator is making much more difficult. So that puts us in a quandary, doesn't it? So we're going to talk about resistance, but we're going to take a different angle and discussing how joy can be a part of it, how creativity. Doesn't the idea of joy feel countercultural in itself right now? We often think of resistance as a struggle. Even the word resistance feels like a physically negative thing. We use words like fight and protest and disrupt. We think of people yelling and pumping fists up in the air. But what if protests didn't have to be violent? What if indeed the most powerful protests were actually not? What if they were tributes to creativity and commitment and vision and even joy? A few days ago, one of you wrote me intrigued with this topic and said, even as we fight serious injustices, we need humor. And they shared a quote from Emma Goldman, who said, "If I can't dance, then it ain't my revolution." And Audre Lorde said, "The sharing of joy, whether physical, emotional, psychic, or intellectual, forms a bridge between the sharers, which can be the basis for understanding much of what is not shared between them and lessens the threat of their difference." Joy that can lessen the threat of their difference. That's pretty powerful. So let's think about this story about the clowns at the White Power rally. After this protest, Tina Rosenberg wrote an opinion piece for the New York Times. Rosenberg is a Pulitzer Prize-winning author about using peer pressure for social change, and a champion for using journalism to report on the responses to social problems. She said, "As counterintuitive though it may seem, ridicule and mockery have long been an effective way to disarm protesters who espouse bigotry and racial supremacy. If you want to resist those who would stir up violence, using humor is far more effective than staying at home when they march, and far better than rewarding their provocations with a melee in the streets." When white supremacists stage a rally, they want to legitimize their views. They want to attract new people to the movement. They want to get media coverage, and they want to feel powerful and heroic. They can accomplish all those goals when counter-protesters respond to violence by throwing fists or rocks. For the same reason that violence by counter-protester helps the far right, mockery hurts. It makes their side look far less attractive to people that they want to attract, and it can point out the foolishness of their message, maybe even enough to have people change their minds. A good joke creates a memorable, clear message, says Rosenberg, allowing the protesters to reframe the issue and attract supporters. Humor engages people on an emotional level, and as long as it's not mean-spirited, it can open them to your message, and it can expose absurdity. A social change strategist, John Jackson, calls it making the invisible visible. This is why cartoons, political cartoons, are so powerful. Or Stephen Colbert's comedy on The Colbert Show was so powerful. It was all satire. Or why skits on SNL can change the direction of a presidential campaign. Or why Borat, aka Neil Sacha Baron, makes everyone so mad when he reveals their true selves. It's funny, but it's also real. And it makes that invisible visible and shows the absurdity of it all. Let's look at some other creative ways of protesting that have had an impact against racism and other oppressions. In Wunsiedel, Germany, some very creative organizers marked another neo-Nazi march. The organizers drew chalk marks on the pavement, marking the starting point of a race, halfway point, and the finish point. So the local residents and businesses pledged to donate 10 euros for every meter the white supremacists marched to a group called Exit Deutschland, which was dedicated to helping people leave right-wing extremist groups. So people came to cheer on the marchers of the event, setting up tables with fruit for the unwitting racers. The whole event turned the marchers into involuntary supporters against their own cause, and brought the community together in unity to counter the messages of white supremacy. How many of you know this house? It's a super gay house. Why is it super gay? Well, because this is the house that is directly across the street from the Westboro Baptist Church, an anti-LGBTQ hate group in Topeka, Kansas. The house was purchased by Aaron Jackson, the founder of the nonprofit organization Planting Peace, after he saw a for sale sign on a nearby house when looking at the church on Google Earth. He had the house painted in the colors of the rainbow flag to show support for LGBTQ rights. There have been gay weddings, celebrations, festivals, and rallies at this house, creatively showing resistance to the message of hate. One of my favorite creative resistors are the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence. They are an order of queer and trans nuns. Since their first appearance in San Francisco on Easter Sunday of 1979, the sisters have fought for the right to express their unique joy and beauty. They have devoted themselves to community service, ministry, and outreach to those on the edges, and to promoting human rights, respect, and diversity and spiritual enlightenment. They use humor and irreverent wit to expose the forces of bigotry, complacency, and guilt that can chain the human spirit. especially for a community that has been so hurt by the church and religion. The sisters use their joy and creativity for healing and change. Here's another example of creativity as protest, although not as joyful. After George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis, art started showing up everywhere. Murals, paintings in the streets, everywhere. Art was how people showed grief, and art became the temple for people to gather, to remember, and to express their pain and their grief. Around the world, in Naples, Italy, in Karachi, Pakistan, to Houston, and here in Phoenix. And I don't believe that we can talk about creative protest without talking about the other plagues that have hit many of us in our lifetimes, including the AIDS epidemic. When AIDS was discovered, it was primarily killing gay men, and the collective response to that was, well, nothing. It was understood to be transmitted through intercourse, and people just could not separate that and the fear that came with it from the beautiful human beings who were dying. Yelling at legislators didn't work. Trying to appeal to the public didn't work. Marches didn't work. So activists who were literally fighting for their lives had to get creative. ACT UP, the organization that worked through direct actions, medical research, treatment, and advocacy and legislation change, had some of the most brilliant protests to get people's attention. There were so many, but erecting a 15-foot giant condom at Jesse Helms' Washington, D.C. home to protest his opposition to the statements and actions against AIDS and those it affected won me their eternal support, for sure. And the AIDS quilt became a somber and very intensely personal way to make the crisis real and understandable. By creating a panel for each person who died, the extreme toll of the pandemic could be seen, and it humanized the people who were affected. Let me mention two more. In Canada, there has been a traveling art show of red dresses hanging outside from trees leading up to populated areas like museums and legislative buildings. Each red dress represents one of the scores of missing and murdered Indigenous women, known as MMIW, who haven't gotten the mainstream attention that they deserve. In the US, homicide is the third leading cause of death among Native women ages 10 to 24, according to the Urban Indian Health Institute. And Native women are victims of murder more than 10 times the national average, according to the US Department of Justice. This art installation made those facts more well known to non-Native communities by their haunting presence. There's one more. What do you do when you keep protesting and keep protesting, you keep praying, but you aren't being heard? Well, in Liberia, the answer was to threaten to get naked. The women of Liberia were tired of civil war. Their husbands were getting killed, their sons were being abducted and pressed into the army, and their families were being torn apart. The women prayed and protested to no avail. There were finally peace talks, so all of the women showed up by the thousands and surrounded the building and filled the halls. But peace couldn't be reached. Negotiators tried to leave, and the women weren't going to let them. How? They calmly threatened to take their clothes off. In many cultures, it's not embarrassing to be naked, but it is humiliating to see someone else naked. The women's threat to take off their clothes was so shameful to the men that they stayed in the building until, at last, they came to an agreement for peace, and it was signed. and this agreement included women in the peace-building process. Rosenbaum sums these creative actions up. It seems too basic to even say, but the rule is violated over again and again. Successful political activists are strategic. They ask what will reach and motivate and convince the people we need. And often the answer is to be creative. Make them laugh if that's what is called for. Make them cry if that is what is called for. Make them stay and work for peace if that is what is called for. Make the people understand if that is what is called for. Ultimately, what it means is that we can resist racism or homophobia or transphobia or oppression. We can resist those who are inflicting the harm without emulating them. We can neutralize them without reaching down to their level. We can do it without violence, without responding back, with hate, but rather with creativity, with strategy, with planning, with persistence, and yes, even with joy. Dr. King told us that it takes a lot of energy to hate, but love sets all of us free. May we recognize, exalt, and emulate the creative spirit and joy that makes our resistance powerful.